Hey everybody, welcome back to Language of the Bible. I'm Harry, and today we're continuing our series called Straight from the Source, where we discuss one piece of extra biblical literature, that is, literature that's Christian or Jewish in origin, however, not part of the actual Christian canon. That is, it's not part of the 39 books of the Old Testament, nor the 27 books of the New Testament, but this is religious content, religious material, and again, the sources are usually Jewish or Christian in origin. Today we're going to be discussing the Mishnah. Now, the Mishnah is basically the Jewish oral traditions that Jesus talked about in the New Testament. Now we're going to give a little background so you can understand the history, the development of the Mishnah and these Jewish oral traditions. So basically, these traditions started to arise during the time of Babylonian captivity, where the first temple, Solomon's temple, had already been destroyed, and now temple worship had been replaced by smaller gatherings. This is the predecessor to the synagogue, which we will see is in full development by the time of the first century. By the time we get to the New Testament and the times of Jesus, we see that the synagogue system is already in place. But this started during the times of the Babylonian captivity, where the temple was no longer available and people got together in smaller groups in house settings, and this was the genesis of the synagogue system. Now, the temple worship, the cult and the sacrifice that revolved around the temple was replaced with an emphasis on Torah, on scripture, the 5 books of Moses. So now the heart of the worship was no longer the sacrifice of animals, but instead it was the study of scripture and learning more about what the Torah had to say. Now, what ended up happening was the Jewish people eventually built a fence around the Torah in order to prevent the people from breaking the Torah, from violating the Torah. They created a fence, and this fence is what we know as the oral tradition or the oral law. Now, during the times of Babylonian captivity, that is when we first hear of the Anshe Knesset, which is the men of the great assembly, the Anshe Knesset Hagadol, the men of the Great Assembly. And basically, the Great Assembly was the precursor to the Sanhedrin, the same judicial body that we see in New Testament times that determined Jesus' death sentence and went to Pilate in order to have him executed. Before the Sanhedrin was in place, we had the Great Assembly. And the Great Assembly was comprised of different Jewish leaders, not only necessarily from the tribe of Levi or from the lineage of Aaron. They were not only from priestly descent, but we also had lay people, other Jewish men who belonged to the other tribes, the tribe of Judah, the tribe of Benjamin, and they all comprised the men of the Great Assembly. And one of the things that the men of the Great Assembly did is they worked on the interpretation of the Torah, and they added these restrictions. They built this fence around the Torah, and these traditions began to circulate. They began to evolve and to grow and to develop as the need presented itself. And after the time of the Anshe Knesset Hagdolah, men of the Great Assembly, after this time, we move to the period of the Zugot, which literally means pairs. This is the time where there was 2 different pairs of Jewish men, Jewish leaders, who were basically the heads of the Sanhedrin. We have the Av Bet Din, which is the father of the House of Judgment. He was basically the vice president of the Sanhedrin. And we have the Hanasi, the prince, literally the prince or the president, the number 1 ranked judge in the Sanhedrin. And these 2 men, the Hanasi and the Av Beit Din, these 2 men worked together and basically represented opposing schools at times of thought, of Jewish interpretation of the law. And again, their teachings were basically authoritative among their disciples. This is when the process of a rabbi and a rabbi having disciples underneath him, that's when this process began. And again, we have these different uh, oral laws that continue to circulate. We finally get to the first century where we have the two major schools within the Zugot. We have the school of Shammai, which was the more conservative school, and we have the school of Hillel, which was the more liberal school. And Hillel was actually the rabbi or the mentor of Gamaliel, a very important Jewish rabbi during first century, who was actually the teacher of Paul, the Apostle Paul that we have in the New Testament. So Hillel and Shammai are contemporaries, and again, they represent opposing schools, a more strict school and a more liberal school. They have their interpretations of Torah, which they pass down to their disciples, and their disciples pass down to their disciples, and so on and so forth. Now, after the destruction of the Second Temple in 70 AD, Rabbinic Judaism, the Judaism that was represented in New Testament times by the Pharisees, it became the predominant form of Judaism, and all other sects, all other representations of Judaism began to die down. And now we have Rabbinic Judaism in full force. We continue to see the circulation of these oral traditions, and they keep on as Israel moves beyond Palestine, as they move into the diaspora, the surrounding nations, in particular in Babylon. They continue to develop these oral traditions until finally, in around the year 220 AD or so, we get the compilation of all of these oral traditions into this multi-volume tome that we know as the Mishnah. And this is finally, for the first time, after hundreds of years of development, we finally have a codified form of the oral traditions. And the oral traditions are separated into 6 orders or 6 sedarim. And within those 6 sedarim, we find 63 tractates. These are smaller sections that are called masektot. And within those masektot, these different tractates, we have different chapters, which are called parakim. And within those different chapters, we have different verses, which are called mishnayot. Now, the Mishnah is a very important resource because not only does it give us insight into the oral traditions that Jesus and the Apostle Paul would have been familiar with during the first century world that they lived in, although these were codified about a century after their deaths, these same traditions would have been existing during their time, less developed perhaps, less evolved, but they probably would have been in existence already then. Also, these traditions that we find in the Mishnah shed lots of light onto the different discussions, the different debates that we see Jesus engaging in the New Testament. When Jesus is confronting people about the temple tax, or when Jesus is talking to people about marriage and divorce, all of these topics, we find lots of background information when we read the Mishnah and read what the first century arguments were. What were the arguments that the school of Shammai and the school of Hillel, contemporaries of Jesus, contemporaries of Paul, what are the arguments that these schools were having concerning these different issues and these different topics at the time? So again, the Mishnah, although it's a Jewish source, it's an invaluable resource for any Christian who wants to engage in deeper study of New Testament studies. And that's it for today's video. Please comment down below if you have any questions, any thoughts, concerns, any disagreements, or any prayer requests. We're here to listen. Take care, everybody, and God bless.